Brilliant. Okay, so let's get started here. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Special thank you, of course, to Marnie, Joe, and to Gail for joining us. We'll introduce them properly here in a minute. But as always, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you may be joining us. I'm very excited for this event today for many reasons, but it is the first time that we're able to have West Coasters join us because we actually did it at a normal hour for those on the West Coast, also those from Asia. So very excited if you're joining us from there. We apologize that our events usually don't work at that time zone. We're happy to see you here today. So I can see we're joined here by scholars really from around the world. We had people registering from China, South Africa, and Holland, all the way to California and Nigeria and everywhere in between. So that's one of the nice parts about these sessions is we really have a broad range of scholars who join us for the sessions. If you don't know me yet, my name is Avi Staiman, and I am the CEO of Academic Language Experts. And this is the latest installment in our Publication Success Interview Series. During these interviews, both today and past interviews, future interviews, I have the honor of engaging in dialogue and conversation with innovative thought leaders in academia about how they're influencing the world of academic publishing. And our hope and goal is really to make a bridge and to connect between the publishing world and authors. And today we get to hear from two authors who wrote a really interesting and fascinating book, and we'll discuss that soon. So today we're going to be exploring the topic of language bias amongst non-native English speakers in the world of academic publication, or against non-native English speakers. This is a topic that is actually very close to my heart and is something that I've wanted to have an event about since the very beginning, since I thought up of this series, because I work and my company, we work on a day-to-day basis with multilingual scholars or non-native English scholars. And we're very keenly aware of the struggles that they face, and the struggles are real, and the struggles can be very acute and difficult. And therefore, in order to address this topic head on, I wanted to invite really, two scholars who really understand this area. First is Professor Marnie Jo Petray of Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania, and Professor Gail Clements from Duke University. Both Marnie, Jo, and Gail are co-authors or co-edited a book entitled Linguistic Discrimination in U.S. Higher Education, which was published in March 2021 of this year by Routledge, and that's why you're here, to hear them speak. So we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. We also were slated to have Professor Adriana Romero Aluvaras from New Mexico State University. She was going to speak about her personal experience with language bias. Well, unfortunately for us, but fortunately for her, she either is expecting or has already had her first child, and therefore she was unable to attend today's event. But stay tuned. She hopefully will join us at an event in the near future. So we wish her the best. All right, so before we hear from our guests, I just want to give you a few words and introduce them. So first we'll start with Marnie Jo. So Marnie Jo Petray is an associate professor in modern languages and culture at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania. She teaches theoretical and applied linguistics and directs the SRU graduate TESOL program, which she developed and founded in 2015. Marnie Jo holds an MA and a PhD in English linguistics and a graduate certificate in ESL from Purdue University, West Lafayette. She's also certified by TESOL, International Association in English Language Teaching Leadership Management. She previously served as the director of the TESL program at Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo, California from 2005 until 2013. Dr. Petray's current research focuses on standard language bias, linguistic pedagogy, and the place of linguistics in second language studies. We're also joined today by Gail Clements. Gail is visiting assistant professor in linguistics at Duke University. She holds a PhD in English and a specialty in linguistics from Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. She teaches undergraduate, introductory linguistics, varieties of English, language and society, and applied linguistics. She has published on Southern English, which I'm excited to hear about, gendered speech, and the scholarship of teaching and learning in linguistics. Again, don't be shy. Ask your questions on the Zoom chat. We'll collate the questions, and as many as we can, we will address them at the end of the interview in a special Q&A session, so be sure to stick around till the very end. If you have a more personal question or something that relates to one of us, more specifically, if you want to ask in private, You can email me at any time. You have my email address here up on the screen. You're also welcome to email our guests today, and we'll be putting up their contact information at the end of the session. Finally, before we begin, I would just like to share a word about the company that I run, Academic Language Experts. We provide customized translation, editing, grant writing, and publication support services to researchers, scientists, and other professionals to help them produce publication-ready texts at the highest levels. We also help scholars who are looking for help with book proposals prior to submission to their dream publisher. We are very grateful and proud to have helped scholars translate, edit, and prepare their research in over 50 languages in 2021. Articles and books we have worked on have been published with top academic publishers, as well as with smaller publishing houses. It's our mission to help support our authors achieve publication success and be a source of guidance and support throughout their journey. So now, without great excitement and further ado, I want to introduce you to Marnie, Joe, and Gail. Thank you both very much for joining us to speak with me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, with pleasure. Okay, so I was hoping that you could just give us a short intro to your research and maybe tell us a little bit of the story behind what inspired you to research linguistic discrimination. How did you even get to this topic of area, and how did this come to interest you?
It started in a committee, Linguistics in Higher Education, which is a committee within the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA, here in the US. And we were talking about what we could do, issues that we saw on campuses. And of course, there's this great research by Dr. Walt Wolfram at NC State here in North Carolina, who has looked a lot at what students are going through, particularly students coming from places like Appalachia that have very distinct Southern or mountain type dialects, coming to a Research One university in a large city. Even though it's the same state, they often experience a lot of language bias and discrimination from professors, other students, and the like. And so he had published a couple of articles, and I said, maybe this is something we should really grab onto, since our entire committee's goal is to talk about things that happen on campuses. So we put together and planned a really great panel of not just Dr. Wolfram, but also Christina Higgins, who had implemented a system kind of like his and trying to get people to confront this type of bias and discrimination. And she's at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. And we had several other people come and join the panel and talk about what their work was and how students and other faculty were impacted by it. After that session, we just had a lot of really good feedback. And then Zev Sundry, who at the time was an editor at Routledge within Language and Linguistics, contacted me afterward and said, I think this would be a great publication. So we did the proposal and started looking for other writers and things like that as well, and other contributors. And the book really grew to include ASL, African American English, Native Indigenous speakers from a particular Native American tribe here in North Carolina, the Lumbee Natives. And it just kind of grew into what we were seeing ESL students in different places. And the topics range from the type of feedback professors give when it's dialectical differences in writing, all the way to professors, particularly female professors at a large Southern research university, not being given the same space, time to talk. That, you know, there were a lot of things gender-wise, race-wise, and ability-wise, particularly with ASL, that we found. And so the book just kind of got a lot of great feedback and has kind of grown into wonderful topics and ways that Marnie and I can share about this information to lots of audiences. So it's been really wonderful.
Fantastic. So Marnie, maybe you can tell us, also, I'm curious if you sort of had a similar way into this area of research, or if you came about it from a different perspective. And then maybe as a follow-up, maybe just help us before we dive into some specific examples, maybe you could just help define terms for us. Like, how do you define linguistic discrimination or linguistic bias? Are those the same thing? Are they two different things? And maybe give us some examples, you know, so we can better understand, you know your area of research, but we're new to it, so we'd love to understand a bit more.
Sure. Yeah. And to piggyback off of what Gail said, I'm also on the Linguistics and Higher Ed committee. So yeah, this really came about as a collaborative effort. The committee is very active in terms of trying to explore topics and research that can really benefit, society in terms of the way that language impacts us all. So I came at it from a very similar perspective as Gail. The key difference between linguistic bias and linguistic discrimination is really one about, the key difference is that linguistic bias is really more about the attitudes or the feelings that a person may have towards another person based on that person's accent, the words they use, the other language that they use, and so forth. And this includes sign language, by the way. So we're not talking just about spoken languages, but also sign languages. So linguistic bias is more about the internal thoughts that we may have about another person based on the language that they use. And mainly, there's implicit bias and there's explicit bias. And of course, we all have implicit biases, which are those, feelings or negative attitudes that we may have that we're not aware of. But we're really focused, that's an important consideration, but we're really focused on explicit bias in terms of this research, because when someone openly or freely feels, okay to think negatively about another person based on their language, or to downgrade or disregard someone based on the language that they speak in whatever form, then it actually gets into the other key term, which is linguistic discrimination. And that's when someone experiences consequences, negative consequences put upon them by the person who has this bias. So for example, we may, have frequently heard comments like referring to immigrants to a country like the United States where English is the standard. The least they could do is learn the language if they're speaking a language other than English, right? So comments like that, or even more marked would be something like speak American, right? So these kinds of explicit negative attitudes and negative comments that are put upon other people, they seem to, they're presumptions, they seem to come from a place of insecurity and misunderstanding. But when someone on the receiving end of this kind of bias experiences things like not getting a good grade or not getting a promotion or being passed over in terms of an opportunity that they are duly qualified for, then it's actually, something much more serious in terms of the consequences. So that's where linguistic discrimination comes in, when someone suffers negative consequences or is treated differently. And so I think that the pertinence of this today really is for non-native English speaking scholars in terms of their experiences in the publishing world. What kinds of experiences do they have? How are they treated differently than their native speaking counterparts, and so forth? So we really hope that our work, research like this, our book, we want to try to raise awareness of why someone who sounds different than us in English or who speaks a different language is not, that's not a valid reason to consider them as different or as deficient, right? We want to try to understand, what language really is and how it works cognitively, socially, psychologically, and linguistically. And our book tries to make clear that different is not deficient.
Got it. Interesting. So, okay, there's a lot to unpack there, and hopefully we'll successfully do it in the next half hour. And I find it's really incredible, especially within the context of publishing, that in theory we have this blind peer review system where everyone's being judged for the content of their novelty of their research and not for other external factors, and yet we see explicit examples of things that I would call anywhere ranging from superficial to downright, as Adriana called it in her op-ed, to downright rude, that really have nothing to do with the heart of the research itself, that seem to, at least in the reviewer's mind, play a very central role in their decision-making process. So, but we'll get into that a bit more. I was hoping that you could tell me a bit about, how did you even go about, it seems like such a broad and such a big topic to cover. How did you go about, in what context did you actually go about studying whether there was linguistic bias or discrimination or not? And maybe just to drive things home, are there specific examples that kind of stuck in your mind, maybe from your field research or things that you came across that really drove home, oh wow, this is real. This is more than just someone saying a flippant comment which rolls off our back, but actually it has a true real life impact on either scholars or students in the higher education setting.
Yeah, there are a lot of examples. We can start with when we ask professors, like I do at Duke often, and I send out this language survey and I say, can you tell me some of the things your students have said about you? Now, at least in the United States, after we teach a class, our students get to fill out an evaluation on us, on what book we used, how we taught, how well they thought we lived up to what the course goals were, how we assessed them. And so they get a chance to reverse that process and assess us. And sometimes those are used in tenure and promotion reviews. And so that's the first way where we see sometimes linguistic discrimination come in. There are lots of comments that I've received. I'll read you one from a scholar at Duke who said, I asked my students to write anonymously what they wanted me to change or improve in my teaching. And this is when one of my students mentioned that I should lose my Hindi accent. Of course, she's a non-native English speaker. She's from India and is teaching languages at the school. And students will write, they will be bold and write things like that down. There are other professors who said things like, there was a Polish professor and she said, I think sometimes students don't understand me. And so I'm working really hard to minimize my Polish accent when I speak English and to be really clear with my students. And so we see it from both sides. We also see it outside of students being able to assess us. There are oftentimes, as professors roll through tenure, promotion, or even job seeking, they're looking at how well I can communicate to the students, how well I can communicate to my colleagues. And if there are obvious barriers sometimes with communication, sometimes those other colleagues are not given an opportunity or a chance. So also in the book, we had a great chapter by John Henner and Octavian Robinson, who are both ASL deaf scholars. One, John Henner here at UNC Greensboro in North Carolina, and Octavian Robinson is at Gallaudet University. And I'll quickly read to you what they wrote as well, since it's their words. Let me scroll to it. There we go. For example, deaf faculty who publish and disseminate work in signed languages on digital media may find their work doesn't count as a publication credit for the purposes of obtaining tenure and promotion. Digital publications, which can be favored by signing deaf scholars, are a part of the larger conversation about digital scholarship and its value in the academy. So what we see are there are various stages where faculty themselves are sidelined or not given a chance at promotion because what they're doing is not deemed as worthy, particularly in publication, or what they're doing is not is judged by others, sometimes students or other faculty and administration, as not on par with native speakers. And it happens to students as well. I've got loads of examples in the intro chapter to the book where students are saying, students stop me on campus and ask me to say things. And they go, oh, you have great English. Okay, well, sure, I've studied English for a long time and maybe I look different. One student happens to be from Korea. But the assumption when you look at people is they might not talk the way I think they should or the way I would like for them to. And this is reverberated back onto students as well. Also in the book, there's an example of a professor who stopped a student in the middle of a presentation, a graded presentation for class, a very formal spoken event. Of course, sometimes we're all a little bit nervous and you might stutter or lose your place in your notes, right? And she was from New York and had a Brooklyn, very kind of thick New York accent. And he stopped her and said, I don't know what you're saying. Write down what you're saying for me so I can read it because I can't understand you. And now this same student was in my class as well at Duke and I was able to understand her absolutely fine. But the perception is if you don't sound like me, if you don't write the way I write or the way the academy that I want to create thinks that you should write and sound, then it's not good enough. It's not standard or correct or proper or prestigious enough. And so that's where we really see these types of things come in. It affects student performance in the classroom. It affects sometimes faculty members' ability to get tenure or promotion. And of course, for this session, it absolutely affects publication, as we saw with the ASL example from Henner and Robinson, looking at digital publication and how that might not be as valued or considered as worthwhile a type of publication. And also, I'm glad you guys are going to talk to Adriana in the future, because having read her work with Science Direct and Science.org, she certainly has a lot of great examples of that as well.
So I want to push back a little bit, and specifically within the context of publication. And let's say I'm going to put my hat on for a minute and from the role of the reviewer. And let's say I do get a paper which I read through it and I find it hard to understand, right? Let's say it's not someone who's in front of me who I can ask them to, restate or, do it in a polite way, but rather it's just a paper of me that, I find it hard to understand, and it might be written by a non-native English speaker. And, where is the line between, clear and coherent writing, which I think we all would agree we should hold our students to a certain level of clarity in their writing, right? We don't want, opaque or unclear or unorganized writing, to the point where, and on the flip side, taking into account and consideration that not only is the language might not be the mother tongue, but actually mode of expression can be very different. I know that, I'm thinking in my head, and we do a lot of translation work as part of my company, the structure of Russian sentences and paragraphs is just fundamentally different than English. So even if I do it in a very clear and coherent way in Russian, or I've translated my Russian to English, it's different. Or in Japanese, for example, there's a lot more repetition that's accepted in articles than in English. So I guess I just struggle with trying to come up with a clear distinction and line between when it's legitimate to say this is not written clearly regardless of language, and when we're saying, oh, we're just going to hold it against you that you've that English is not your mother tongue, and good luck.
Do you want to take that one, Marnie, or do you want me to?
Sure. I can, but we both can, but I'll chime in first. So I think it's a valid point, and it's really important to understand that research in linguistic discrimination is not about lowering standards, right? We're not here to advocate for lower standards just so that more people can have more accolades in whatever form or fashion. It's more about awareness and understanding what linguistics actually is and how language works societally, and to understand that when people bring prejudices based on their presumptions about language, which are completely inaccurate, it actually has negative consequences that are unfair. And that's what we're trying to rectify. I think that the context of the publication is super important for editors or for companies like yours to consider, right? So if the scope of the work is international, that may set up a different set of expectations than if the journal is regional or national. But I think that I think it might be useful to invoke the idea of English as an international language as a metaphor to bring to the consideration in terms of how it should be acceptable as long as expression is clear. If writing has an accent, we shouldn't judge that just the way that we wouldn't judge a person who has an accent in their spoken writing, right? But that doesn't absolve any of us from the need to produce quality research and to do it in a way that is understandable to whatever the audience of the journal is. So there's some give and take on both sides. I mean, certainly, if a person has, so here's another issue, another wrinkle of the same issue. I think it's highly problematic to presume that just because a person is a native speaker of a language, that their writing is automatically error-free and beautiful, right? I mean, I know of plenty native speaker scholars who really struggle with their writing and have to go through several drafts to get it into publishable form, right? That should be no different than for a non-native English speaker. By the same token, just because someone is a non-native English speaker doesn't mean necessarily that their writing is going to be problematic. They should be given the same benefit of the doubt. So language status should not matter in terms of what is expected of a scholar. It should follow from the quality of their work.
Yeah. It's so interesting to me. This is one of the things that Adriana brings up in her op-ed, and I see this on a daily basis, is how quick reviewers are to say, as like a main comment in an article, this article needs to be edited by a native English speaker, otherwise it's not understandable. And so and I think that, I'm not even sure that reviewers necessarily understand the offense that can cause in terms of, and that it's tough, because I think it is their job to really take the time to read through and judge it based on the quality and of the content, and not on, whether every single grammatical rule was followed. That being said, reviewers, all of us have probably reviewed an article at one time or another, and we're doing it voluntarily. We don't have all the time of the world, and we're doing it sort of, and it's easier. It's probably easier. It probably is easier to read through an article which is written by, which is written in standard English, and we'll get to that question of what standard English even means, or is there such a thing? But I think that, I think what you're doing is so important, because just raising the awareness to maybe something subconsciously that we're doing when we're reading these, and just, judging it because it's a little bit more difficult for us, or it takes another extra few minutes for us to, digest and comprehend, and use that part of our brain to both understand the material and then try and judge it based on the quality of its contents. Even if we can accomplish that, I think would be, really a step in the right direction. So that's not really a question, but
No, I would agree. And I'll also add before I toss it to Gail, we really want to try to be big tent with respect to the impact that we hope to have. The changes that can come, the benefit that can be had by understanding what this process is, can be on the small, intimate level, and it can be actually systemic. So everything within that scope is, what we hope for.
Yeah. There's some really good research, particularly about academic reviewing, by Pulsar, Al's, Guillermo, and Gali. I think it comes from September, just 2020. So it's fairly recent. And what they did was they actually took the same abstract and did two versions of it. So it was the same content, but one was a little more international and one was more sort of standard American English. And then they sent those to various publications and waited to see how the reviewers judged each one. So the content was the same. And so what they found was that they were told things like non-native, like English abstracts, had lower ratings of even of the scientific or content quality. They didn't only get comments about make sure that your prose or that your English is more standard or more academic. They got a lot of comments about the science of said article or abstract and work not being good enough or on par. And so the assumption was, if your English was not standard in some way, that somehow your scientific method, your results, your analysis would not be quality to be published.
Yeah. We actually wrote up a report on this, about a year ago, because we did a survey of non-native English speakers and their experiences with publishing. And and one of the things that really the inspiration for putting together this report was a project. There was a book that we had edited. We edited it from start to finish, and it needed editing, and we did a pretty thorough job. What ended up happening was we submitted it to the publisher, or we helped the scholar submit it to the publisher, and the publisher came back and said, well, this needs to be edited before it's going to be accepted for publication. And needless to say, we were quite shocked, because we said, we had just spent 6 months editing the book, then to be told it needs to be edited, so we started questioning ourselves and saying, well, maybe there's something that we didn't do here, well enough, and we need to revisit. But so we reviewed the book, and it read well. So we wrote back to them and said, are there specific examples that you can give us? And they turned around without any embarrassment and said, oh, no. That's a standard line that we put in for any research that we get from outside of Anglo countries. We just put in a line, have this edited for language. They didn't even look at the book. They just assumed that it needed to be edited regardless. And I think that's just, that sort of typifies the attitude and approach. Again, I don't think it's necessarily, always explicit. Maybe there are certain cases that it is, but even the implicit bias can be tough. So Alana, maybe you could share that report if anyone's interested in reading it. I want to move on and ask about, we touched on this topic, this question of standard English. So I think, sort of the common wisdom is that there's correct English and incorrect English, right? But if you actually dig a little bit deeper, you realize that there is no such thing as as acceptable English and not acceptable English, there are actually many different variants of English, depends, right, between the US, the UK, South Africa, Australia, India, and all other, and in many other countries where English is either a very primary language or even a secondary language, there could be different variants, and there would be very difficult to come up with one standard English. So can you just maybe lay out for us what, when you're using the term standard English, what it means? Do you think there is even such a thing? Is there such a thing as standard English? And if not, then how are we supposed to relate to questions of how we use language within the context of publications?
It's a complex question. And the answer to whether or not there is such a thing as standard English is both yes and no. So first of all, just to define, so standard and non-standard are terms that come originally from the discipline of linguistics, sociolinguistics, excuse me. And, their usage today is actually controversial. There are some scholars who don't want to use the term because outside of academia, they are, those words have baggage. And so we're trying to get away from that. We're trying to get away from judgments and so forth. But the basic idea is that standard language or standard languages or standard language varieties are those varieties in a culture where the society is deemed them to be prestigious. They are the ones of social cachet. They are the varieties that represent typically white, educated, and socioeconomically privileged populations. And the non-standard would be the varieties that are not privileged, right? The ones that don't get the recognition as being the right or the proper varieties of language to use. So the yes part, that there is, such a thing as standard versus non-standard, is the fact that there are these judgments that societies make about, labeling something as the prestige or the prestigious variety, the idealized version. But the no part is again, back to linguistics, the idea that no one language variety is better or more communicative than the other one, right? There shouldn't be any value judgment between what's good and bad, what's proper and improper. Those are social designations that are added on top of that. And sociolinguists recognize that. But another part of the question is, is it real? And we're talking about idealized forms. We're not talking about actual forms that people use in an objective way, right? So part of the no is that the standard as it's written, the standard variety as it's written or understood, is really based on the written form of a language. Yet the rules for written variety get applied to spoken variety. And written language and spoken language are different processes. They're different systems, right? So applying rules from one to the other is highly problematic. So there are a couple of references I can provide for folks who want to look into this more. In our book, Chapter 11, Languaging Matter, addresses this distinction about standard and idealized forms of language, especially with respect in our book for standard American English or standard American educated English. But the same thing would be true in other cultures. So within British society, there is a standard of English that's used that's considered to be the prestigious one. The same thing would be true of any language, right? So Spain in Spanish in Spain, Spanish in Mexico, and so forth. There's nothing special about English that makes it have this, distinction of having a prestige variety. So Chapter 11 in our book is useful, and also with respect to English, Libby Green's work, which I know you'll bring up later, her book English with an Accent, the chapter that deals with standard language issues, is the standard language myth, and that's a book that I recommend people read as well in terms of educating themselves about what it means.
And
yeah,
standard is also really problematic because it's a moving target.
Yeah.
So if we think about Southern speech, where I live here in North Carolina, ain't is commonly used by people. And of course, when you're growing up, everyone says, oh, ain't a word, because ain't in the dictionary. It's kind of the little phrase, but it actually is in the dictionary. And wonderfully, it was standard English at the time of Shakespeare. So you can read Shakespeare's works and he uses ain't, and it was standard at the time. It was brought to these colonies that are now the United States. It was maintained particularly by rural speakers in the South. And now those speakers are called out for maintaining that traditional, archaic, conservative form that used to be once was very standard and now is not anymore. So this happens with lots of things. What used to be considered standard is not always now still. Something that wasn't standard now is. You can look at strong and weak verbs for this in English. You can look at verbs that were considered standard before that now are not, or forms that are changing. And we can look at, I pled guilty to the crime, because that should be the past tense. Now, if you look at most newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, Miami Herald, Chicago Tribune, really big newspapers in the US, they will say, I pleaded guilty, which to me sounds so foreign. But there's a double, you can do one or the other now. Both are considered standard. As a matter of fact, Grammar Girl, which is a website a lot of people use in the US when they have these kinds of questions, she says that pled is the old form and hardly anyone uses it anymore except lawyers. And I thought, well, maybe it's becoming more jargon specific, but at one time it was highly standard. And now speakers just over the course of time are regularizing that form. Instead of it being an irregular or strong verb, it's moving into the more regular or weak verb category with the ed ending. So that's a change in progress we can see right now. So older speakers might sound like they're not using the correct form, but it was a correct form. And why can't it still be a correct form? So this idea of anything standard is a constantly moving target. Marnie mentioned the varieties of English around the world, not only educated Englishes, but all different kinds of English around the world. And we can look at, she also mentioned Spanish. It's a perfect example. Many people will tout the Castilian Spanish of Spain to be the standard, to be the best or preferred variety. But if we look at Mexican Spanish and Spanish in Honduras or Guatemala or in the Caribbean, there's so many different kinds of what would be considered standard for those localized areas. And so what we have to do with English as academics is open up a little bit more, like Marnie said, to some sort of international kind of standard where we're not only looking for British or American ideas about grammar and syntax and phonology and morphology and structure, but where we're saying, you know, this is actually fully comprehensible as well. And I understand it and you understand it and we speak different Englishes. So maybe there's room for that in academia and in publishing.
So
if I can, oh, sorry, I was just going to piggyback two quick comments. A really good example, too, of the moving target of standard is even with closed grammatical categories. So typically things like pronouns in a language don't change for, centuries, if not millennia. The usage of gender neutral they as a singular marker, they and their, is becoming much more commonplace. Thankfully, it's been used in that capacity for decades, if not longer, but it's finally becoming more codified as something that's acceptable. It's still got some ways to go. I just actually had a conversation with a colleague the other day where my usage of gender neutral singular they was marked as grammatically incorrect. So we had to have a talk about that, in terms of what I was choosing to do. But it's way more efficient to use they or their in the gender neutral singular category than it is to use he, she, or they, them, or whatever. A second thing I was just going to say quickly is the implications for this economically are also really high, right? The textbook publishing industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So whatever is considered to be the standard oftentimes has been reflected in the textbooks that are published and get used in classrooms. And depending on what that variety actually is, says a lot about what the value is behind what's considered to be prestigious.
Got it. Okay, so I wanna take this if we take this, I'm purposely exaggerating, but if we take this to its end point, and we haven't even hit on this, but the standard language for publication around the world is English. Okay, and we could talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether we should be opening up more journals to other languages or to multi-language journals. I think there's a whole maybe session in and of itself about that question. But let's take for granted now that English is the standard language. To what extent do the editors of journals and reviewers of journals not only, meaning how do they balance between being respectful to the author and respecting their, maybe let's say, variant or the way that they express themselves in English versus how it's going to be understood and comprehended and digested by the readers? So I'm trying to think of an example where let's say you have an Indian writer where there are, probably 70 to 80% is going to be standard and recognized by a typical American writer, but there may be some things that are a little bit different, or examples that are different, or certain terminology that's used that's different. And I think so long as the differences are superficial and external, then I think we can live with that. I guess the question for me becomes, at what point do we say, we actually have a responsibility to the readers that they can understand, and when we're communicating, we need to be using we need to mean the same thing when we're using certain words in order for communication and dialogue to flourish. Otherwise, we're just speaking past each other. So how do we balance those two, values or competing between respecting the author and also wanting the readers to kind of be on the same page and yeah.
Well, I could start, and then Gail, you can jump in as well. I think that it's probably difficult, if not impossible, to come up with one set of rules, right? So context is key here, because the context has to include who the audience for the journal is. So I think every journal is, it's incumbent upon them to consider what their audience is and maybe give direction to potential authors as to how they would choose for language to be dealt with, rather than keeping it hidden. Hopefully it's not. But I think that the standard, or I keep using standard, that's an unfortunate usage there. The linchpin for when something is comprehensible versus not is going to be meaning, right? So if meaning is obscured, then that's a problem. If meaning is not obscured, but the context of the writing can actually help the reader figure out whatever the meaning is, then I think that's a case of more flexibility as opposed to less. I'll start there. Gail, what about you?
I agree. I think there is a difference. When we say standard, what we often mean is comprehensible. Is it mutually intelligible? If we think about that test in linguistics. And sometimes that test is problematic itself, but if I can read something, whether it's written more casually, whether it uses maybe some terms I have to go look up, or if they're defined within the text in some way, if a structure is a little bit different, but I know what it says, even if it's not how I might do it, or I might teach others to do it. It's about not jumping to that quick decision, right? Of saying, this isn't, quote, good enough. It's about balancing the way we would like to see English packaged, or how we were taught to package it, with how we realize English is now a lingua franca. It is all over the world. And of course, those different geographical, political, and socio-historical reasons for English being in so many different places are vastly different around this globe. Sometimes it was readily accepted, sometimes not. And so we have to look at those histories and say, what are people blending with English here? How are they using English? For what purposes has this culture used English? And so that we can move forward. I realize it in the example you gave, Avi, about the stock line of anybody who doesn't come from an English speaking country just gets the line of, well, you need to clean up this English. What a publication like that could start doing is actually not automatically putting that there and saying, let's actually read it for what it's worth. Maybe there's only a couple of areas where we think a native English speaking population may have a little difficulty or may have some trouble. And so it might be wise to pinpoint your ideas and give specific feedback instead of just generic things like that, particularly at a review stage of a publication. But it is difficult. What Marnie and I, sometimes when we were writing the book, felt like we were walking a tightrope. Should we advocate for just full on whatever English you want to use? No, because then everyone in various communities may not be able to read that. The BBC often does some of its articles online in Pidgin. And if you go and you're not familiar with Pidgin and you don't know what that looks like or what the features of various Pidgins around the world are, or Creoles, it could be really difficult for a native English speaker from any country to fully understand what's being said in those articles. So we do need to have some sort of generic English that is mutually intelligible to most, but does it have to be what my idea of standard is as an academic at Duke University, as a native English speaker? It doesn't have to be my idea of standard. It doesn't have to be someone else's idea, but we should be able to settle on something that is comprehensible, understandable, and is not so far on the spectrum of Englishes to be polarizing, where some can't read it and some can't understand it, but various structures should be allowed. Sometimes different terminology, like I said, as long as it's defined. So some of those surface type things, I think we could begin to work through and get over. It's just some people maybe aren't ready, or the publication industry itself has such a long history of doing things a certain way that it takes a few people in that industry itself to start saying, maybe we can do something a little differently here.
Yeah,
it's possible.
All right, so I want to come full circle, and I want to be able to, to make this, to finish as practically as we can. I can tell you, I don't know, about the audience today, but I can tell you there were definitely a number of publishing, representatives and editors that registered for this event and will be watching it. If you had the opportunity to tell them two things, number one is, who should they be looking out for? Who are the most, in your research, what did you come across? Who are the vulnerable populations that you think are most susceptible to, to being a target? Again, I don't want to say it as if publishers are targeting authors, but who's most likely to face this type of bias, number one. And then number two, any, just ideas or tips or for us to become more aware and more sensitive of, how it is that we respond. If, let's say, a reviewer says, I do need to respond, I do need to address this, is there a way in which it can be done within a review or within a conversation about improvement that maybe puts a little bit of a different spin or frames things a little bit differently than, what's typically, what I've seen, at least in my, in my experience from reviews?
If you want to go, Marnie, first, that's fine, or I'm happy to go.
Sure. So I would say definitely, I mean, again, back to the idea or that economy that's represented by the term standard, non-standard, the folks who are most likely to be disenfranchised are the ones who speak varieties that are not the prestige, right? So if they happen to be dialect speakers from, an underrepresented minority population, or if they happen to be second language speakers, they're more likely than not to experience, the discrimination that we found. And I think it's important to go back to the idea of what the assumptions are, right? So it's highly problematic to assume that just because a person is a native speaker of a language, that they're not going to have writing problems. It's equally problematic to assume that if they're a non-native speaker, that they're going to have writing problems, right? So it should not be a situation of people being treated differently based on presumptions of what their first language status is. We all want well-executed and high-quality work to come out, right? We benefit from all that in terms of being academics, and that shouldn't change. So I think we all have a shared responsibility to tap into the resources that we have. Writing, especially in academia, should be a collaborative process. So, no one should expect to not have to do some sort of review or some sort of editorial work, but at the same time, it shouldn't be different just because a person is a speaker of a different language. So if the writing is accented, but is comprehensible, I think it should be, it should rest on its own merits. I'll start there.
Yeah, it's a difficult line to walk, because who is the one who will judge whether it is understandable or not? So if we look at some of the research that's been done on academic reviewers, if they are looking at the same scientific work, just written in two different ways, is it our lack of awareness or lack of expertise in varieties of Englishes or varieties of languages even that might make it difficult for us to judge those two equally and fairly? So what we saw out of that research was people were downgrading the scientific quality of the work because it was presented in a bit of a different way structurally. And so that can be a difficult issue. What we have to do as reviewers, what we have to do as publishers, what we have to do as people in academia is sit down and say, is that my own lack of awareness? Is that my own lack of knowledge? And often university professors view themselves as the gatekeepers of said knowledge, whatever your area of expertise is. So I am allowing someone to pass my class because they showed a certain level of memorization, knowledge, application, skill, whatever it might be. And you assess them on that, and you allow them to move from your course to the next level of courses. And that is it's a great place to be, but it's a difficult place to be for a lot of people. Same with reviewers. It's your job to say whether the content of this work is worthy of progressing forward and being published. So it's a difficult spot, but what we have to do is start to recognize that we might be coming at someone else's work with our own bias. So what we see in a lot of the chapters that we went through is Ho'omana Horton, who's at Oklahoma State University here in the US, worked in the Writing Center during his PhD and really looked at how African-American English students were writing. And again, while the content of their work was often well done and well commented on by instructors, even when the instructors had been doing some training on African-American English, they still rated those students' papers lower. So sometimes it's not just about awareness, it's about sitting back and actively combating what we've been taught ourselves as how we should write, how we're supposed to write, and how everything is supposed to read in academic publications. Now, I'm not saying again that some of those works in his studies would be completely easy to understand by everyone. But again, that's where an editor could come back and say, we really love the content of your work, but we're afraid because of the context of our audience, be it here in the United States or be it all over the world, we really need this written in a type of English that's a little more international, that can be a little bit more clearly understood by a variety of English speakers. Probably even wording it in that way might have the writer, the PhD student, the academic, whoever it might be from wherever they are, sit back and say, oh yeah, this isn't just for me. This isn't just for my university, my students, my colleagues in the South, in the North, in India, in Japan, in Britain, wherever you might be speaking English, in Australia, in Canada. It's for the entire world of English speakers. And so that may be a way to begin to approach it, is to separate the content from the way the content is packaged. And that might be a way that we can begin to move people in a way that is, I hate the word standard, but some sort of international English that more people will be able to access and find accessible, so that that work can be published and be in a variety of locations around the world where people speak English.
Yeah. No, I think that's really, you're making some very salient points. And, I can tell you on a very real practical level, this idea of good writing and good English being confused is something I see all the time. And in fact, where we have, I had this marketing dilemma at a certain point with our company, is that, we're marketing ourselves towards non-native English speakers, but I'm a believer that everyone needs our services sort of on an equal level. It's not, if you're a non-native English speaker, that doesn't mean you need editing any more than a native English speaker. Unfortunately, it's generally, it's only those who don't have English as a native language to be humble enough to be able to turn around and say, I need help, can you help me? Whereas the native English speakers will say, well, I grew up with this language, so of course I've done everything correctly, and why would I need any help? Sometimes, it's humorous to me sometimes when some of the native English speakers actually get that comment that they need a native speaker. That I've seen that as well, that they need a native speaker. So I think we should, I think reviewers, in addition to what you were saying, I think reviewers just need to, have the humility to be able to say, I don't know who's on the other side of this, or even if I do know who's on the other side of this, I'm not going to prejudge them and I'm really going to try to focus on the ideas. And that takes an extra mental effort. It really does, because it means we might need to read the paper an additional time, or take some extra time to understand what the individual is getting at, or maybe even look up a few terms. That's not the worst thing in the world if we learn something new while we're reading as well. I have a lot. Let
me give a quick shout out to one of the participants today, Filippo Contesti, has a really good point in chat that I wanted to bring to the fore. Yeah. So I think it's also incumbent upon journals to diversify their own editorial board, right? Mm-hmm. So the presumption, again, that native speakers are going to be the magic solution to solving all writing problems is just, it's actually ludicrous, but it's also ineffective. It's not true, right? So they'll actually do themselves a favor by diversifying their own editorial board to bring in different viewpoints, so that this, you know, kind of review can be more representative of who the population is that's actually submitting research.
Yeah, no, I think that's Filippo makes a very, very important point there, and I don't think anyone, I think that in general, in fact, I was speaking to one of the major publishers that everyone here would be familiar with. I won't mention, and they said they turned around 5-10 years ago and they realized that they didn't really publish any Asian authors that weren't in like an English speaking country. They just didn't have anyone, and we're talking about a massive publisher with thousands of books a year, and they're like, maybe that's something we should do. And it's like and to me, what's incredible is that we're actually missing out. We're impoverishing science by dismissing certain works before we even treat them seriously. I mean, what I've seen is sometimes journals are so overwhelmed that they just sift through it. It's like, okay, it's like a sifting expedition, and they're like, we have 300 articles and we can only take 25 of them, so we're just going to use some sort of very external criteria to be able to sift through and just find the ones that we want. So they'll knock out anything that the English isn't perfect, they'll knock out anything that didn't exactly follow their formatting rules, and then they'll look at the rest. And what we're actually doing is we're actually missing out on really important and critical and sometimes new perspectives that we couldn't have had otherwise, and we're all paying for that. We all end up we're all impoverished if we're not getting the best science out there. So I think Marnie, you mentioned this before, this is not about a lowering of standards. It's about trying to be a little bit more attentive and open so that we actually can take in the best work, because maybe the way that we're doing it now is not actually doing that, and that's in all of our interests. All right, I would love to continue this conversation because it's fascinating and it's fantastic. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. And so I just, and the chat has been fantastic. So thank you to everyone who's been, I don't know if we've ever had such an active, sort of conversational chat as we go along. So that's really great. Oh, wow. And there's even more and more. So this is fantastic. But if anyone has any specific questions for Gail and Marnie, this is the time to throw them in the chat. In the meantime, if you can put up the, so we're going to do two things now. First and foremost, we are going to share the upcoming events, which I encourage you to join if they're of interest to you. This is a monthly interview series that we have coming up next month. We've got Ivana Aransky, who is the co-founder of Retraction Watch. I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with Retraction Watch. Very important work that they do. They basically make sure that journals that print science that is then proven, inaccurate or is based on faulty research, they're sort of the watchdog, and they make sure that journals are retracting problematic research. And he's doing some really interesting work. He's sort of like a journalist researcher. So I highly encourage you to check that out. Alana, if you can keep on scrolling down, you may be able to click on the, oh no, we don't have the next month. Okay, in February, we don't have this up yet, but in February we'll have Christy Henry, who's actually the director of Princeton University Press, is going to be coming to join us to talk about transparency in research. So we encourage you to check that out as well. Now, I also, before we get to any last questions, I want to share our contact information here up on the screen. So anyone who has any questions or wants to follow up with any of us individually, you're welcome to do so. Marnie and Gail were kind enough to share their email addresses, so you're welcome to be in touch with them. If you have any language or publication support needs that we can help you out with, we're more than happy to do so. The way I like to think about it is that in the end, after all is said and done, and this entire conversation, those not native English or non-native English speaker, those who do decide to get editing help, in the end, generally are better for it and end up actually increasing the chances that their article is going to be accepted, because having another intelligent reader or two or three to be able to go over your work and give you some tips and feedback is good, regardless of the way that you write. And what variant of English or whatever the language it is that you use. We also offer translation services, so please feel free to be in touch with me about that, and also feel free to be in touch with Marnie and Gail. So I saw a lot of comments. I don't know if I saw any specific questions. Was there anything that you think we that's worth reviewing that we didn't necessarily address head on in the conversation?
Well, excuse me. I think a lot of this stuff was really answered quite, on the spot, really.
Okay, fantastic. So let's finish off with one final question to leave us off with, and I would say so you had mentioned before, Marnie, about Rosina Lippi Green, who she was a linguist who called linguistic discrimination the last backdoor to discrimination. And claims that that's the door that stands wide open. So just taking this conversation and thinking about it in the general context of, of discrimination in general, would you agree with that statement, and that, that it's the last, I guess, explicit form of discrimination? Obviously, that's a pretty loaded question. But how do you see it within the context of discrimination in general?
So I would agree. I mean, we've made some progress, certainly. And one of the ironic things about linguistic discrimination in higher ed is that campuses tend to be, bastions of liberalism, right? We try to champion underprivileged and minority populations to sort of to right the discrimination that exists in other kinds of ways. But for some reason, language has not been historically included in those lists of things that we need to be aware of. So I agree that linguistics and language varieties need to be added to that as markers of our identity, because it's we're disenfranchising folks who shouldn't be suffering in that kind of way.
Fantastic. Gail?
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking, how would I say the things that I've said on here in a very sort of standard presentation style? How would I explain them to my uncle, or on my mom's side of the family, who's very Southern? And I kind of came up with this idea, and it doesn't sound like what people want me to sound like. So I have actually started to try to begin to change students' perspectives and colleagues' perspectives. In my classes, I will give examples. I will bring in video of myself talking to my mom's family or my dad's family. I will, tell them it's okay if you want to talk like this here or there or somewhere else. And depending on the context you're writing for, it might absolutely be fine as well. So I think what we have to do is really just kind of take our little corner of things, right? Take our little spot in the university or in publication or where we're researching or where we are with our colleagues, and maybe begin there, because we're not going to change everything overnight. We're not going to suddenly shift things. And the idea of where we're shifting may not be the same for everyone. So there might be some places where we still need something more akin to a standard, and then other places where we can be a little more fluidic within the type of English that we use. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to come today and talk about it. And like you said, the chat was really interesting. I'd also like to, Marnie put something in the chat about us doing an international linguistic discrimination version of the book we have here based in the US on campuses. And I would love to encourage anyone, if you have research like that or would like to do research like that, or someone who does, to please reach out to us through our email and kind of just give us a hint or clue about what your research is or what someone else's research to be, because we certainly know that there is linguistic discrimination in other countries, and it's just pulling that research and trying to find it and bring it together. Because this is a conversation not just for English, but in so many different language families in the world.
Brilliant. Yes, definitely. This is you didn't know that by showing up today, you would not only learn about linguistic discrimination, but also have an opportunity to get another chapter, to write a chapter which not only will help your CV, but also does good for the world. So Gail and Marnie, thanks so much for the great work that you do. Keep it up, and I'm looking forward to seeing the next volume. And thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It's been great.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.